The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek as Beatrice Lawson clutched her medical bag tighter, her heart racing with each step toward the notorious outlaw bleeding out in Doc Morrison's clinic. The year was 1875, and at 23, Beatrice had never imagined her nursing skills would be tested on the most dangerous man in the Arizona Territory, Gabriel Blackwood himself. "Miss Lawson, I need those bandages now." Doc Morrison called out as she entered the small clinic, the metallic scent of blood hanging heavy in the air. Beatrice hurried forward, her blue calico dress swishing around her ankles. The wounded man lay on the examination table, his broad shoulders nearly spanning its width. His face was contorted in pain, yet even in agony there was something frighteningly controlled about him. "He's lost too much blood," Doc Morrison muttered, pressing a cloth against the gunshot wound in Blackwood's shoulder. "I need to remove the bullet, but I can't stop the bleeding alone." "I'll assist," Beatrice said firmly, already rolling up her sleeves. Gabriel Blackwood's eyes snapped open at the sound of her voice, piercing blue eyes that locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "No women," he growled, his voice like gravel despite his weakened state. Beatrice straightened her spine. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm the only nurse in town. It's me or you bleed to death. Your choice." A tense moment passed before his eyes closed again. "Make it quick, Doc." For 2 hours, Beatrice worked alongside Doc Morrison, her hands steady despite the reputation of the man beneath them. Gabriel Blackwood, cattle driver, gunslinger, bounty hunter. Stories of his exploits were told in hushed whispers throughout the territory. Some said he'd killed 20 men, others claimed it was double that. The only consensus was that he was dangerous, a man whose heart had hardened long ago. When they finally extracted the bullet and stitched the wound, Doc Morrison wiped his brow. "He needs rest now. Sheriff's posted a deputy outside, but I need someone to monitor him through the night. The fever could take him if we're not careful." Beatrice nodded, knowing what he was asking. "I'll stay, Doc." "Are you certain? This man is a patient," she finished firmly, "nothing more." When Doc Morrison left, Beatrice sat beside the unconscious Blackwood, studying his face. The hard lines of his jaw were softened somewhat in sleep, and without the intensity of his gaze, she could see he wasn't much older than 30. A scar ran along his right cheekbone, and another disappeared into the collar of his blood-stained shirt. His hands, now resting at his sides, were large and calloused, the hands of a man who'd lived a hard life. What circumstances had hardened him so? Beatrice wondered as she pressed a cool cloth to his fevered brow. What series of events had turned a man into such a feared legend? As the night wore on, Gabriel's fever spiked. He thrashed against invisible demons, occasionally muttering names Sarah, Thomas, with such anguish that Beatrice found herself speaking soothingly to him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. "SH, you're safe now," she whispered, not knowing if he could hear her. Near dawn, his eyes suddenly flew open, startling her. The blue of his irises was made more intense by the redness surrounding them. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Beatrice Lawson. I'm a nurse. You're in Doc Morrison's clinic in Willow Creek." Recognition dawned in his eyes. "The bullet removed. You'll live, Mr. Blackwood, though you might wish otherwise when the pain fully registers." To her surprise, a hint of a smile touched his lips. "Wouldn't be the first time, Miss Lawson." Over the next 3 days, Beatrice tended to Gabriel's wound, changing bandages and administering medicine for the pain and infection. He spoke little, answering her questions with single words or nods, his eyes following her every movement with an unreadable expression. On the 4th day, as she changed his bandage, he finally asked, "Why aren't you afraid of me?" Beatrice's hands paused momentarily before continuing their work. "Should I be? Most people in this town cross the street when they see me coming." She secured the fresh bandage before meeting his gaze. "I'm not most people, Mr. Blackwood, and in my experience, a man's reputation is rarely the full measure of who he is. In this case, it might be an underestimation," he said darkly. "Is that so?" Beatrice gathered her supplies. "Well, reputation or not, you're still healing and you'll tear those stitches if you don't rest properly. Try to sleep." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Thank you." The words seemed to cost him something to say, as if gratitude was a currency he rarely spent. Beatrice nodded and left, unsettled by the warmth that had spread through her chest at those simple words. By the end of the week, Gabriel was strong enough to sit up and take short walks around the clinic. Sheriff Parker had visited twice, making it clear that once Blackwood was well enough, there would be questions about the shooting that had landed him in Doc's care. "I didn't start it," Gabriel had said flatly. "Never do you, Blackwood," the sheriff had replied skeptically. Beatrice had intervened then, insisting her patient needed rest. After the sheriff left, Gabriel had given her a curious look. "You shouldn't get involved in my affairs, Miss Lawson. I'm involved in your recovery, Mr. Blackwood, nothing more." But even as she said it, Beatrice knew it wasn't entirely true. Something about this man, this complex, dangerous, wounded man, had begun to occupy her thoughts even when she wasn't at the clinic. It was foolish, she knew. Gabriel Blackwood was exactly the kind of man her father had warned her about before she'd left Boston for the frontier. A man with no roots, no future, and too much past. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach when he looked at her, or the way her skin tingled when their hands accidentally touched. 2 weeks after the shooting, Doc Morrison declared Gabriel fit enough to leave the clinic. "Where will you go?" Beatrice asked as she helped him button his clean shirt, a task made difficult by his still tender shoulder. "I have a small cabin about 10 miles north of town," he replied. "It's not much, but it's private." Beatrice nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment settling in her chest. "You'll need to change the bandage daily and watch for signs of infection." "I can manage." "Of course you can," she said, unable to keep a hint of sarcasm from her voice. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Just that men like you always think they can manage everything alone." "Men like me?" "Yes, Mr. Blackwood. Men who believe that needing help is a weakness." His jaw tightened. "In my experience, Miss Lawson, relying on others is usually a mistake. Is that why you keep everyone at a distance?" To avoid making mistakes, for a moment, something raw and vulnerable flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by his usual guarded expression. "You don't know anything about me. I know you called out for Sarah and Thomas in your fever," she said quietly. "I know pain when I see it, Mr. Blackwood, even when it's carefully hidden." Gabriel's face hardened. "Don't," he warned, his voice low. Beatrice stepped back, suddenly aware she'd crossed a line. "I apologize, that was unprofessional of me." He finished dressing in silence, donning his gun belt with practiced ease despite his injury. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you for your care, Miss Lawson. I won't forget it." And then he was gone, leaving Beatrice with an inexplicable sense of loss. 3 days passed, and Beatrice tried to push Gabriel Blackwood from her mind. She focused on her other patients, on the letters from her family back east, on anything but the memory of intense blue eyes and the lingering questions about the man who possessed them. On the 4th day, she was gathering herbs in the meadow beyond the schoolhouse when she heard the approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she felt her heart skip as Gabriel Blackwood reined his black stallion to a stop beside her. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, trying to sound composed. "Is your wound troubling you?" "No." He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his recent injury. "I came to give you this." He extended a small leather pouch. When Beatrice opened it, she found a collection of rare medicinal herbs some she'd mentioned were difficult to find in these parts. "Where did you get these?" she asked in amazement. "I know where things grow," he said simply. "Thank you, they'll be very useful." An awkward silence fell between them. Gabriel shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I also came to apologize," he finally said. "You were right about me keeping people at a distance. It's a habit formed from necessity." Beatrice studied him, surprised by his admission. "We all have our reasons for the walls we build, Mr. Blackwood." "Gabriel," he corrected her. "After saving my life, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." "Gabriel," she repeated, liking the way it felt on her tongue. "Then you must call me Beatrice." He nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Beatrice, would you care to join me?" She asked impulsively, gesturing to her half-filled basket. "I could use help identifying some of these plants." To her surprise, he agreed. They spent the afternoon wandering the meadow, Gabriel pointing out herbs and explaining their uses with a knowledge that impressed her. He was different outside of town, more relaxed, his sentences longer, his rare smiles coming more freely. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Beatrice realized she'd enjoyed herself more than she had in months. "I should get you back to town before dark," Gabriel said, helping her onto his horse before mounting behind her. The ride back was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. Beatrice was acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arm around her waist to steady her. When they reached the edge of town, he stopped the horse. "I'll let you walk from here," he said. "People talk." Beatrice understood. A woman of her standing being seen with Gabriel Blackwood would certainly cause gossip. Still, she felt a pang of disappointment as she slid from the horse. "Thank you for the herbs," she said, looking up at him, "and for the company." Gabriel's eyes held hers for a long moment. "Perhaps I could call on you again." It wasn't quite a question, nor was it a statement. It hung somewhere in between, like Gabriel himself seemed to exist in a space between the man people thought he was and the man Beatrice was beginning to see. "I'd like that," she replied honestly. Over the next few weeks, Gabriel found reasons to visit Willow Creek more frequently than he ever had before. Sometimes he brought Beatrice herbs or interesting stones he'd found. Other times, he simply appeared at the clinic near closing time, offering to walk her home. They talked about books she'd read, places he'd seen, the changing seasons, careful conversations that skirted personal history but gradually built a fragile bridge of trust between them. Beatrice knew people were talking. She saw the looks, heard the whispers that ceased when she entered rooms. Even Doc Morrison had gently suggested she be careful about the company she kept. "Gabriel Blackwood has a past, Beatrice," he'd warned. "Things that can't be undone." "Don't we all have things we wish we could change?" she'd replied. But despite her outward confidence, Beatrice couldn't help wondering what those undoable things might be. The rumors varied that he'd been an enforcer for cattle barons during the range wars, that he'd ridden with outlaws before turning bounty hunter, that he'd killed a man in a dispute over a woman. Gabriel himself offered no explanations, and Beatrice didn't ask, afraid that pressing too hard would shatter whatever was growing between them. And something was growing, something tender and unexpected that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. She found herself watching for him, her heart racing at the sight of his tall figure approaching, her dreams filled with his voice and touch. One evening in late October, Gabriel invited her to ride with him to see a particular view before winter set in. Beatrice agreed, ignoring the disapproving look from her landlady as she set out with him just after dawn. They rode for several hours, the terrain gradually becoming more rugged as they climbed into the foothills. When they finally reached their destination, a high plateau overlooking the valley, Beatrice gasped at the panorama spread before them. The autumn-painted landscape stretched for miles, the distant mountains rising majestically against the clear blue sky. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "I found this place my first year in the territory," Gabriel said, standing beside her. "I come here when I need to remember there's more to the world than what men build and destroy." There was something in his voice, a wistfulness, perhaps, that made Beatrice turn to look at him. His profile was etched against the sky, his expression open in a way she'd rarely seen. "Who were Sarah and Thomas?" she asked softly, finally voicing the question that had lingered between them. Gabriel tensed, and for a moment Beatrice thought he would retreat behind his walls again. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "My wife and son," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "They died of fever 8 years ago while I was away driving cattle to Kansas." Beatrice's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Gabriel." "I wasn't there when they needed me most," he continued, staring out at the horizon. "By the time I returned, they were already in the ground. Sarah was 22, Thomas was 4. Understanding dawned on Beatrice, the hardness, the isolation, the reputation for violence. "You've been punishing yourself ever since." His jaw tightened. "I've been surviving." "There's a difference between surviving and living," she said gently. Gabriel turned to her then, his eyes filled with a pain so raw it took her breath away. "I don't know how to live anymore, Beatrice." I've done things, been someone I never thought I'd become. Beatrice reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Perhaps it's time to remember who you were before. I'm not sure that man exists anymore. I see him, she said with quiet certainty. I see him when you gently handle wounded animals, when you help Mrs. Peterson carry her groceries, when you taught those children to fish last week. Gabriel looked startled. How did you know about that? Willow Creek isn't so large that kind deeds go unnoticed, even when the doer tries to hide them. A flush crept up his neck. They were just hanging around the creek with nothing to do. Beatrice smiled. You don't have to justify kindness to me, Gabriel. They stood in silence for a long moment, their hands still joined, the vast landscape spread before them like a promise of possibilities. I should get you back, Gabriel finally said, though he made no move to leave. Not yet, Beatrice replied, stepping closer to him. I want to remember this moment. Something shifted in Gabriel's eyes, a hunger, a longing that matched her own. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he raised his free hand to her cheek. Beatrice, he murmured, her name a question and a prayer on his lips. She answered by closing the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with the release of weeks of unspoken desire. His arms encircled her, drawing her against his chest, and Beatrice felt herself melting into him, her heart pounding with a joy so intense it was almost painful. When they finally parted, both breathless, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. I shouldn't want this, he whispered. I shouldn't want you. Why not? Because men like me don't deserve women like you. Beatrice pulled back to look into his eyes. I think I should have some say in what I deserve, Gabriel Blackwood. A smile, a real, unguarded smile, transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. You're a stubborn woman, Beatrice Lawson. So I've been told, she replied, smiling back. It's served me well thus far. They returned to Willow Creek as the sun was setting, both aware that something fundamental had changed between them. In the weeks that followed, Gabriel became a more frequent visitor to town. He helped repair the church roof after a storm, assisted the blacksmith when his apprentice fell ill, and even reluctantly accepted Sheriff Parker's request to track a gang that had been terrorizing nearby settlements. People's attitudes toward him began to shift. Nods replaced averted gazes, greetings were offered instead of silence. But not everyone welcomed his presence or his growing relationship with Beatrice. Vernon Reed, the banker's son who had long expressed interest in Beatrice, confronted them one Sunday after church. You're making a fool of yourself with this killer, he said to Beatrice, his face flushed with anger. Gabriel's hand went instinctively to his gun, but Beatrice stepped between them. That's enough, Vernon. He's using you, Reed insisted. Do you even know how many men he's killed? Do you know what they call him in Texas? I said that's enough, Beatrice repeated firmly. My associations are not your concern, Reed's eyes narrowed. Your father would be ashamed to see you with a man like him. The words struck their mark. Beatrice's father, a respected physician in Boston, had high hopes for his daughter's future, hopes that certainly didn't include a relationship with a notorious frontiersman. Later, as Gabriel walked her home, Beatrice was quieter than usual. Reed was right about one thing, Gabriel finally said. Your father wouldn't approve of me, Beatrice sighed. My father doesn't understand the West or the people who make their lives here. He sees everything in black and white. And you don't? I've been a nurse too long to believe in absolute right and wrong, she said. I've seen good men do terrible things out of desperation, and I've seen cruel men perform acts of unexpected kindness. Gabriel was silent for several steps. I have killed men, Beatrice, more than I care to remember, in self-defense, most of them. His voice was heavy with the weight of memory. Some as a bounty hunter bringing in men wanted by the law, a few, he paused, a few during the range wars when I worked for men who cared more about property lines than human lives. Beatrice stopped walking, turning to face him. Do you regret those deaths? Gabriel met her gaze unflinchingly. Every single one. Even the men who would have killed me without hesitation. I regret that there wasn't another way. His honesty touched her deeply. This was not a man who gloried in violence or wore his reputation proudly. This was a man haunted by his past, trying to find his way back to something better. The past cannot be undone, she said softly, but the future is still unwritten. Gabriel reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses earned through years of hard living. You make me want a different future than the one I'd resigned myself to. What future is that? One where I'm not alone, he admitted, vulnerability evident in his voice. One where perhaps I might deserve happiness again. Beatrice's heart swelled with emotion. You already deserve it, Gabriel. You just need to believe that yourself. Winter descended on Willow Creek with a ferocity that kept most people close to home. The clinic was busy with colds, frostbite, and the occasional broken bone from falls on icy paths. Gabriel's cabin was too remote for regular visits during the worst weather, but he managed to make it to town every week or two, often staying at the hotel for a night before the journey back. During one particularly harsh blizzard, he remained in Willow Creek for nearly a week. On the third day, as they sat by the fire in Doc Morrison's parlor, the doctor having grudgingly accepted their relationship, Gabriel asked about her life before the West. Why did you leave Boston? A woman with your education and background could have had a comfortable life there. Beatrice smiled wryly. Comfortable, perhaps, but confined. After nursing during the war, I couldn't return to the life my parents expected, teas and socials and waiting for a suitable marriage proposal. You saw combat hospitals? Gabriel asked, surprise evident in his voice. Beatrice nodded. I volunteered against my father's wishes. I was 18 and thought I understood what war meant. Her expression grew distant. I learned quickly how little I knew. Gabriel reached for her hand. That explains a lot about you. What do you mean, your steadiness under pressure? Your ability to see beyond surfaces. His thumb traced circles on her palm. Your compassion for damaged things. You're not damaged, Gabriel, she said fiercely. Wounded, perhaps, but not broken. He lifted her hand to his lips. If I'm healing, it's because of you. As winter slowly released its grip on the land, Gabriel and Beatrice's relationship deepened. They spoke more openly of their pasts, Gabriel sharing stories of his Texas childhood and his brief, happy marriage. Beatrice recounting her struggles to be taken seriously as a nurse and her decision to seek independence in the West. By early spring, Gabriel had begun spending more time in town than at his remote cabin. He took odd jobs breaking horses, helping with early planting, even assisting the sheriff occasionally. His reputation was gradually being rewritten in the eyes of Willow Creek's residents. No longer just the dangerous gunslinger, he was becoming Gabriel Blackwood, a man of quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. Not everyone was convinced. Vernon Reed and a few others still watched him with suspicion, and there were those who believed a man couldn't outrun his past so easily. But for the most part, the town had accepted the change in him and in Beatrice. One evening in April, as wildflowers began carpeting the meadows around Willow Creek, Gabriel invited Beatrice for a ride. They followed the creek north, the water high and rushing with spring melt, until they reached a small clearing surrounded by cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out. Gabriel helped Beatrice dismount, but instead of releasing her, he kept his hands at her waist, his expression unusually serious. What is it? She asked, concern creeping into her voice. I've been thinking, he began, then stopped, seemingly searching for words. I've been thinking that my cabin is too far from town. Beatrice tilted her head. Are you considering moving closer, in a manner of speaking? He took a deep breath. I bought land here, Beatrice. This land, I've started building a house. He gestured to the clearing. It's not much yet, just a foundation and some framing, but by summer it could be a home. Beatrice looked around, suddenly noticing the cleared area and the stacked lumber partially hidden by a tarp. Gabriel. He took her hands in his eyes intense with emotion. I know I'm not the man your father would have chosen for you. I know my past will always follow me to some degree. But I love you, Beatrice Lawson, more than I ever thought possible after Sarah died. You've brought me back to life, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of that gift. Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes as Gabriel reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. This was my mother's, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you marry me, Beatrice? Will you help me build not just this house, but a real life, not just survival?" For a moment, Beatrice thought of her parents' expectations, of the safe and predictable future they'd envisioned for her. She thought of the whispers that might follow her as the wife of Gabriel Blackwood. She thought of the challenges they would undoubtedly face. Then she looked into the eyes of the man before her, this complex, honorable man who had fought his way back from despair and knew there was only one answer she could give. "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, Gabriel, I will marry you." With hands that trembled slightly, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her gently into his arms. As his lips found hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows, Beatrice marveled at the journey that had brought them here, from a wounded outlaw and a determined nurse to two people who had found in each other the healing they both needed. They were married in June, with wildflowers adorning the small church and most of Willow Creek in attendance. Doc Morrison gave the bride away, his initial reservations about Gabriel long since replaced by grudging respect. Even Sheriff Parker offered his congratulations, shaking Gabriel's hand with genuine goodwill. Their home was finished by late summer, a sturdy, welcoming house with wide windows that looked out over the creek and distant mountains. Gabriel continued to work with horses, developing a reputation as a skilled trainer whose methods relied on patience rather than force. Beatrice maintained her nursing practice, though she now divided her time between the clinic in town and caring for those in the outlying areas who couldn't easily reach Doc Morrison. Together, they built a life that neither had dared imagine for themselves, a life of purpose, connection, and deep, abiding love. There were challenges, of course. Occasionally someone passing through would recognize Gabriel and old stories would resurface. Beatrice's parents remained distant, unable to understand her choice of husband or life on the frontier. But these were shadows that could not dim the light they had found together. In each other's arms, they discovered that the past need not define the future, that hardened hearts could learn to love again, and that sometimes the most unexpected journeys led to the most perfect destinations. On their first anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Gabriel pulled Beatrice close against his side. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing a life with me over everything you left behind?" Beatrice turned in his embrace, her hand coming to rest against his cheek. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "You are my home, Gabriel Blackwood, you always will be." And as the last light of day gilded the land around them, Gabriel gathered her gently into his arms once more, knowing that in her love he had found his redemption, his purpose, and his peace.